Okay, now indeed we are in progress. Okay. So watch, now probably I'm all muted, aren't I? Something always happens. Okay, so let's go ahead and get going. There we are. So let's go and start chapter 1, right? Welcome to anatomy and physiology. So finally, we get to kind of dig in and start to play for keeps a little bit. So we're going to be taking a look, first of all, getting ourselves sort of settled in, right? So chapter 1 is largely just kind of getting our feet wet, kind of getting our kind of foundation. And then once we kind of get into chapter 4, it's going to get really meaty, and that's kind of where it starts to really, all the sleeves start to get rolled up, and we grab a shovel and we start digging, right? So that's where all the heavy work goes. But there are some important topics in chapter 1. Much of this is just sort of general overview, so I don't spend a lot of time on that one, because I assume that at this point in our life, we kind of have a fairly intuitive sense of where most of the body parts are on us, right? And that's a fair assumption. Sometimes that's not a good assumption. I've actually been disappointed in the past. I'm like, how do you not know where this is? Anyway. And you want to be a nurse? It can be interesting actually teaching A&P. So we're going to take a look first of all at some overalls, right? Sort of lay down some basic and general principles. And we're going to start with actually the title of the course itself, right? Anatomy and physiology. What exactly is it? So anatomy is simply, for lack of a better description, which this is a better description, essentially body parts, right? You're counting body parts. That's basically what you're doing in anatomy. So you're looking at structure, and that's the key to anatomy. So you're focused on structure itself. So what is it? And to a lesser degree, what does it do? But a lot of anatomy is basically characterizing what it is, okay? And so that's a lot of what consumes our first semester here. Physiology, on the other hand, is a functional look at things. So just because you know what it is doesn't mean that you have the first clue what it actually does, right? And so unless you're like an orthopedist or something like that, you need to learn a little bit more about how things work. And that's typically A&P2. That's where we get into a lot of that physiology discussion. So when we're looking at functions, so not just how does the structure look, but how does it actually work? And when you get into medicine, when it's broken, how do we fix it, right? That's what medicine is about. But in order to know how to fix it, you have to know how the thing works first, right? And that's the reason why you're here. So healthcare is all about fixing stuff, but just like a good mechanic, you can't fix a car unless you know how it works in the first place, right? And that's what we're doing here. How does things work? Now, typically speaking, any given instructor will oftentimes, especially in A&P, will tend to sort of lean toward one or the other. Okay, some instructors are very structural type people, like this guy over here, not D'Anthony, right? This guy over here. Some of you guys met Dr. Benson late, who kind of hung around late, but he's a chiropractor. He is all about the first semester. A lot of folks are like that. Bones, muscles, how it all connects together, range of motion, things of that nature. A lot of anatomy in there, okay? So they tend to lean on anatomy. That's their sort of sweet spot. That's their happy place. Then you get folks who are more physiological. An endocrinologist, for instance, would be very physiological. Neurologists would oftentimes be very physiological. And so doctors who specialize in the core systems oftentimes are specialized physiologists. They spend most of their time asking questions, how does it work? Okay, and how do I get it working again? So they're not counting body parts. They're usually measuring things. They're doing blood work on you to try to figure out some sort of a metabolic level in you to see if they can solve some sort of a physiological problem, right? And that's kind of where I lean. I, as a biologist, kind of waffle between both. Anatomy people tend to sort of love structure for the sake of structure, right? They're kind of like puzzle people. They enjoy Sudoku, which I've never understood. Because the only thing worse than a word puzzle or word problem or a crossword puzzle, that's what I'm looking for, is a mathematical crossword puzzle. I've never understood that one. I'm just not a Sudoku person, right? So if I'm doing something like that, I want to actually solve a legitimate problem, not just waste time, right? That's kind of the way I am. So what I do is I look for function. If there's some sort of a mathematical operation I'm doing, I'm not just doing it for kicks and grins, it's going somewhere, right? And that's kind of what physiology people are like. We've got a function here and we've got structure that underlies this function. Structure doesn't exist in isolation, and it doesn't just exist for kicks and grins. It's not like Stonehenge. It's there, but nobody knows why, right? It's there and everybody knows exactly why it's there because it has a very specific purpose and a very specific role. And it has absolutely no reason to be there outside of that role, okay? So that's kind of the way a physiology person sees it. They see structure as necessary to get what they want, which is the function. Whereas anatomy people tend to be happy with structure. They're Sudoku workers, okay? Mr. Sudoku over here. I like to pick on Benson because it's just fun. And those of you who know him know that it's fun to pick on him. He's good about it. He enjoys it, I think. But when we take a look at anatomy, let's take a look. There's different ways we can sort of cut this up, right? No pun intended, I guess. But anyway, there's different ways we can look at this and divvy this up. So gross anatomy, which oftentimes you've heard about, right? There's actually been, I think, TV shows called that, right? Gross anatomy. Is basically when you're taking a look at large structure. That's what gross means. It's like you're sort of backed out and you're looking at sort of global structure from sort of like a broader view of things. That's what it means to be gross. So gross anatomy oftentimes in med school is the anatomy of the entire body. So you're looking at the whole thing, right? So that's what gross anatomy is. Notice you're not using close-up stuff. You're not using microscopes and stuff like that, right? That's a different kind of a scenario if you start pulling out the microscopes. And if I'm in your guys' way, let me know, because I don't have to sit here. I can only sit over there. I can walk around. I can actually stand. It's just that I'm on my feet all day. So it's kind of nice to sort of sit here and hang out with you guys, right? So it gives me a chance to sort of hang out with the cool kids and actually hope and sort of pretend like I'm actually cool sometimes, which I'm not. But anyway, so you can break this up then. If you're not looking at a global view of it, you can break it up by region, right? That's regional anatomy. You can break it up by systems. You can do systemic anatomy. That's where you're looking at the anatomy of a particular system itself. Your body is three-dimensional, right? And it's deep. So if you're just looking at one layer, like that, so like kind of snorkeling on the surface kind of an idea, that's surface anatomy. That's basically where you're just sort of looking at surface structures and you're not getting all that deep. A dermatologist, for instance, oftentimes can be characterized as surface anatomy, right? Because you're just on the surface of the body itself. Now, what happens if you toss the microscope in there? Well, here you start to get into a cellular and molecular type of anatomy. Right. So now you're kind of doing the same thing, right? You're looking at your body, seeing how it's constructed, how it's put together structurally. But all you do is you just take the same idea and then you break it down on a cellular level. So now you're asking, well, how are the cells and the tissues constructed structurally, right? So we want to take a look at a structural view of the tissues themselves. If you're looking at the cellular anatomy, right, the way that the cells are put together, that's cytology. So cyto basically means cell and ology means the study of. So cytology is the study of the cell. That's what that is. So this would be like a cellular biologist, right? Histology is when you kind of move that up a bit, right? Where you're looking not at the cell level, but you're looking at the next level up, the tissues level. So you're looking at maybe multiple different cell types that are interacting with each other or connected to each other, and you're asking yourself, how are you guys operating as a team at the tissue level? Okay, so that's kind of where you study things, is histology. And histology is mostly actually where we begin. in 2101. And then we kind of start moving up. Okay. Matter of fact, that's one of our first lab units. So in next week's lab, next Tuesday, we're going to begin the first of 2 weeks of histology. And so you're going to have lots of microscopes. So if you haven't had recent microscope skills and you want to brush up on that, that would be a good thing to do before Tuesday, just to kind of give yourself a little bit of a head start. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be, lost. If you don't, you will pick it up quickly, right? It's kind of like driving, it's like you pick it up quickly. Most because we're teenagers when we do that and we want to drive and it's exciting for us. So we're like, right, we're all happy about it. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing next. So that's kind of, those are different anatomical ways of looking at the world. They're all anatomy. How do you know they're anatomy? Because you're focused on structure at whatever level you break it down, whether it's systemic or cellular or histological. If it's all about structure studies, how things are put together, that's an anatomical view of things. Okay. Now, the important thing about anatomy is that in particular really hits us for the most part, right? Because a lot of us will be, maybe some of us will be nurses, right? Some of us will be rad tech. Some of us will be, different types. We'll need to know body types. We'll need to take images perhaps or things of that nature. You kind of want to know where the body part is before you actually try to take an image of it, right? I mean, if you're looking for cranial images and you're trying to get a picture of their ankle, that's like a failure of like AMP1, like the first day, right? So you got to know where your body parts are, especially for things like imaging, because imaging is very body part specific. And if you've ever looked at imaging training, like ultrasound, for instance, just because you learn ultrasound doesn't mean you can do ultrasound for everything. Matter of fact, you have to go through a separate certification process for every part of the body. So like in cardiology, which is my background, somebody who is a certified sonographer for echocardiograms is not qualified to do carotid ultrasounds. They have to get a separate training and certification to do carotid ultrasounds, even though technically both of them use ultrasound, right? So the body part is important when it comes to imaging. Now, what kind of imaging are you looking at? Well, the standby, right? X-ray, we've all had X-rays, right? You just basically zap yourself with some radiation, and then you just essentially look at the way that the solid tissue versus the soft tissue kind of interacts with the X-rays. Right? We've all seen those. Ultrasounds is basically sound waves, right? So sound will travel differentially through different densities of tissue, and then you can sort of create a picture essentially of the tissues that it goes through. And so that's basically a very common, a very popular one, by the way. Patients oftentimes love this one because it's super non-invasive. It's kind of cool. It's kind of fun. Patients generally like to do these, especially an echocardiogram. Those are really fun because you can actually see your heart on the screen pumping. You can see the blood going through it. Echocardiograms are really cool. It's kind of like seeing the little baby inside the womb, like as it's sort of doing like little loop-de-loops and things like that. It's the same thing with your heart. It's really cool. You can get a lot of information from a good echocardiogram, which is an ultrasound. CTs, basically, this is where you're going to be using X-ray images to kind of get kind of cross-sectional slices of tissue, and then you basically put those slices together. So the important thing about having it computerized is that you can basically have the computer either isolate slices so you can focus in on a particular area of the body, or you can kind of build the entire section up slice by slice and you can kind of take it out. That's very, very useful actually, to be able to zero in on different areas of the body. So DCA, digital subtraction angiography, this is kind of like CT as well, but in this case you're using a dye. Typically CTs don't. If you use a dye, then you're kind of in this area. It's a contrast, basically. The dye kind of creates a contrast for your camera to be able to see it, because otherwise those cameras can't just see body fluids. Body fluids are invisible to them. And so you have to light it up somehow in order for the cameras to be able to detect it. MRIs are interesting and fascinating, right? I mean, who doesn't love a good MRI, right? Okay, claustrophobes. I know you guys are laughing at me and smirking at me. You're like, yeah, no, I don't like going into the tunnel. I had an MRI actually in October, and I kid you not, I actually fell asleep in there. So apparently I didn't have a problem with being in the little tube. It was actually, I thought that was quite relaxing. It was a little noisy, but yeah, it was like, I'm like, I fell asleep in there. It was comfy. They had good music going on in there. So I just, they had me all covered up with a little blanket. I mean, it was like as a little kid, you know, it's like, you want a little blanket? I'm like, sure. Why not? You know? Yeah, I know, right? It's like, here, wake up. We got to need you to roll over or something like that. Okay. So, but no, what this uses is magnetism, right? So this basically doesn't use radiation, right? It uses different types of radio waves and things like that. There's like magnets in there and things like that that are kind of going back and forth. That's the reason why they have to disclaim whether or not you've got pacemakers and things like that, right? Because they don't want your pacemaker blowing up in your chest and that sort of stuff. Right, but I mean, it's different because what happens, it's totally a chemistry thing, right? Because as you put yourself into a magnetic field, you're kind of you're in this sort of quantum mechanics zone. That's what's happening when you kind of do this sort of magnetic resonance thing. So atoms and electrons and things like that start to behave very differentially when they enter into a magnetic field. That's kind of one of the weirdnesses of quantum mechanics. And depending on who you are and what you are, you kind of behave a little bit differently. Image-wise, that creates different sort of optical effects, which the camera can capture, which gives you really, really good resolution. That's the reason why MRIs are really, really good. And because it's not beholden to density of tissue, it's any tissue that will do this. You're able to get soft tissue images off of the MRI. That's the reason why if you need to get an image of a torn ligament or something of that nature, you go MRI. Right, not CT or X-ray, because it's not going to show up as well, because it's not beholden to the density of the tissue. PET is really cool. Positron emission tomography. This one's really cool. This one, what you do is you use a label. So you use a radioactively labeled glucose, and your tissues will utilize glucose differentially, right? So and your glucose metabolism is all tied into like your insulin cycles and your glucagon cycles, and there's a lot going on in your glucose regulation and stuff like that. But your tissues will use the glucose differentially. So when you use a PET with labeled glucose, it gives you this kind of metabolic snapshot of how your tissues are utilizing glucose. So you can imagine then that if you're a diabetic with uncontrolled diabetes, you're going to have a very distinct PET signature because your cells are not appropriately, or normally I should say, utilizing glucose because of the dysregulation of your glucose homeostasis. Okay. There's a lot more, by the way, you can do with PET. We used to play with PET in grad school all the time. So it really is, it's pretty cool. You can use fluorescence PET, light things up, and I mean, it's really cool. So this is your basic X-ray, nothing very shocking there, right? We've all been around the X-ray block a few times at this particular point. Ultrasounds, oh, isn't it cute, right? So you can see nice, very good detail. You can see all the fingers, you can see the little eyebrows. I mean, you can see a lot of good detail. So ultrasounds are not just invasive, non-invasive, but they're actually really, really, really good diagnostic tools in the hands of the right doctor. A doctor who really understands ultrasound and how to analyze them and get quantitative information can really get a lot of good information from an ultrasound, which I really appreciate, because most patients would rather you get information from something non-invasive than to go gouging them and filleting them like a bad fish. right? So here's your CTs. You can see basically you're kind of building this. This is kind of like a kind of a computerized kind of constituted section where you can kind of see the individual CT sections there and the stripes. They're just basically recomposing it. And so you can see a lot of different types of information there visually, especially for like a neurologist, when they do like a CT of the brain or an MRI of the brain, they can see different lesions in the brain that are potentially problematic because they have different optical properties in that particular field as well. DSA, this is an angiography. So here you can see you're looking at some of the coronary arteries and you're kind of taking a look and you're looking for blockages at this particular point. So an angiogram oftentimes looks like, so in cardiology, we did a lot of these to see if we can actually find blockages or interruptions to blood flow, which are typically what will cause a heart attack. The MRI, which is awesome, basically looks like what it would look like if we just sort of sawed your head open and just kind of looked at it, right? That's the reason why MRIs are so popular. You know, small little claustrophobic tube notwithstanding, is because you do really get probably is the best image relative to what you have to go through in order to get it. It's probably one of the best ones out there. That's the reason why doctors like it a lot. Here's your PET. So you can see very similar to like a CT, only in this case, like for this one, this is one where you can actually see current activity, right? So you can take a look at, say, for instance, the person's brain or whatever, and they use like radioactive glucose. That's just one version of it. You can use different metabolites and things like that. You can look at neurotransmitter usage and things of that nature. This is the kind of one where you have active changes that you can visualize in real time. And like we've all seen those images where we say, oh, well, when you show a person this, it's like this region of the brain lights up and you can actually see it light up like that. That's oftentimes what you're doing here, because you can see these things in real time. You can see how the brain gets active, how one part of the brain gets darker when it gets inactive, or gets brighter when it gets active. You can see it as correlating to brain damage. Or if you see a lesion on MRI and you do this and you see a brain activity response around that lesion, then that suggests that lesion is causing problems because it's changing the way that the brain activity is occurring around that lesion. So with all of these together, you actually have a lot of really, really good, powerful tools that you can glean a lot of good information off of. But guess what? Before you actually get to play with these, before you get to drive these sports cars, you have to learn how to drive, right? So before you get to drive the Ferrari, you have to actually know how to drive a manual transmission, right? Because if you have a sports car that's an automatic, it's not a sports car. I'm sorry. That's just, yeah. So that's just the way that is. But anyway, the other one I always like to say is, if you're not a little afraid of your sports car, then it's not a sports car, right? Your sports car should always feel like you are riding on an atomic bomb. I don't, but I've driven some. I've driven some before they gutted them and made them sort of affordable for the masses, like back when they were really sports cars. A couple of my friends have had some. I'm all like, I'm kind of a little afraid to drive this. This feels like it's about ready to blow up on me, and it's gonna go fast. And I don't know if I can handle this because I'm not a IndyCar driver. So, but yeah, if you're not a little afraid of your car, it's not a sports car. It's a family car. It's a minivan with cool wheels. Anyway, that hurt, doesn't it? I can say that, by the way, because, well, I've got a minivan. But anyway, you know, I hate to admit it, but they're powerfully functional. Probably the only thing more functional than a minivan is a truck in the right hands. It's hard not to like something that's that functional. Everybody laughs at me at Home Depot, and I'm like, hey, I've got the 12-foot boards in my minivan. How about you? So I'm getting it done one way or the other. Tie it on the top. So anyway, that's me. If you're wondering, the 12-foot board sticking out of the back of the silver minivan, it's probably me. But anyway, okay, so that's anatomy, right? How about physiology? Let's take a look at this one. So what types of physiology are there? Well, there's just like with anatomy, there's different ways of breaking up physiology. So there's cell physiology, right? So this is looking at really specifically intracellular processes. So how are these individual cells working and acting and behaving? So that's a really, really important one. And then there's systemic physiology. That is to say, how are these organ systems interacting with each other, right? So oftentimes when the organ systems are interacting with each other, it's founded on the foundation of the cells interacting with each other. Does that make sense? So it's the cells that are producing these communications that allows the organs to talk to each other. And so that oftentimes in physiology, it all kind of blurs together, right? And it all basically boils down to the activities of the cell. Because once you understand the activities of the cell, the rest of it is just about forming teams, right? It's like the best thing you can do. Okay, so football, right? Still football season for a little while. And I've already admitted that I'm a Raider fan, or did I? No. I did, okay. And amazingly, I'm still alive, so I'm impressed. So you guys are benevolent Bronco fans or non-Raider fans. But it's still football season. Granted, my team has never gotten close to the playoffs, but still there's other teams that are there. And I mean, one of the things, like, you know, when you're looking, because it's about ready off season time, right? The Broncos are going to be looking, well, they're looking for a coach, but then they're going to be looking for players. They're going to be looking to find who to draft, right? And so one of the things with a good football team is the hardest part is get a good football player, right? Regardless of the position, get a good football player. So that's the athleticism, right? So that's the first thing. Once you get a well-trained football player, then kind of putting them together is kind of what all the X's and O's and the coaches do when they kind of get all these new players in. They say, okay, so you can do this and you can do this. So that means we can do this because I'm going to put you guys together in this package. And then when we find ourselves at, you know, 3rd and long, then I'm putting this play set out there. You players are going to go out there on the field, and that's because of who you are, right? So first of all, understand your players. Are you a good football player? That's what teams are doing in the offseason when they're trying to figure out who do you want to draft, right? They're mostly, they're talking about, like, are you a good quarterback, or are you a good defensive back or something like that? Yeah, that's true. But really what they really want to know first and foremost, and this is where a lot of that heavy lifting is are you a good football player? Yeah. Are you good at your position? That's also helpful. That's also good. But are you a good football player, right? Do you have to be a safety? Can we turn you into a defensive back? Can we turn you into a corner? Can you play the outside? Can you play the slot, right? So they're asking those questions, and all those are predicated on is, are you a good football player? Because if you're a really good football player, then we can turn you into whatever we need you to be, right? But we need to make sure that you're well trained as a good football player. That's what you're doing here. Once you understand the good cell process, then you can put your cells together to create tissues as you need them. Does that make sense? Yes, that was a digression, but it was going somewhere. Right? Isn't that what I said? I said I digress, but it did go somewhere. Anyway. Okay, so in systemic physiology, there's obviously, you break it down by system, right? So you have neurophysiology is a pretty popular one, right? You're focused on nervous system there. Cardiovascular physiology, that's one of my faves. That's basically looking at the heart and the blood vessels and everything related to cardiovascular pieces as well. Now, there's also some disciplines that sort of cross paths between both, right? So anatomy and physiology, they kind of look at both of them a little bit together. The first one is pathology, right? So pathology is looking at both the structure and function of tissues, usually disease tissues, okay? Pathology is a really hard discipline. Pathology is sort of related to histology. Why? Because remember, we said histology is anatomy, right? With the microscope, it's the anatomy of the tissues, yes? Pathology is also anatomy of the tissues, but it also incorporates in that functional piece because it looks at disease tissues. So what a pathologist oftentimes will do is basically take a look at a tissue sample, analyze its structure and its function, perhaps, depending on if it has to do functional assays to see what the cells are actually doing. and they're looking at potentially diseased tissue. So when you go somewhere and you get a biopsy and they send it out, they oftentimes will send that biopsy to a pathologist who will run the tissue sample over a series of assays, both structural and functional. And their job is to compare your tissue to what is expected from normal tissue. And if your tissue is abnormal, then the pathologist can write that down in the report, let the doctor know that this is abnormal tissue and you have cancer, as an example, right? So that's what a pathologist does. So pathology, you have to both know what normal looks like and what abnormal looks like. So pathologists are really, really well trained. Histology, the reason why it's related to histology, can be thought of as the normal study of normal tissue. Pathology is the study of tissue that is diseased. Okay. For the purpose of diagnosis. That's usually what you're doing. You're trying to diagnose something at the cellular level. Exercise physiology, right? That's one of you guys' favorites. So in exercise physiology, you have both the structural changes and functional changes, right? That are all related to exercise. Structural, why? Because as you exercise, you change your body mass, right? Your muscle mass, things change in your body in response to exercise. So that's structural. Also functional. I mean, can I bench press 250? No. 10? Maybe. I'll start with 5, right? Yeah, okay, good. So I'm not even gonna lay down then. That's how that's gonna work out. I'm already tapping out before I even try. So I'm comfortable with where I am and where I'm not. I'll admit it, right? So you're not gonna see me in a gym. I say that proudly, right? It's like, you say that proudly. I do actually. It's probably the worst place that you could ever put me. That would be like hell for me. If I've done something horribly wrong in life, my eternity is to be spent in a gym. Unless it's like swimming, I'll go for that one. That's good. That's a little on the heaven side. But yeah, in there with all the equipment, with all the meatheads and all that. No, I'm sorry. I'll just like, can I go to hell, please? I mean, at this point, I'd take my chances with the flames and the screaming torture because it's kind of already there. But anyway, that's being recorded. So that was all free, by the way. That won't be on the exam. Yeah, anyway. So there that is. So right, function, because obviously if you do a lot of exercise and you do get muscle bulk, you're going to be able to be stronger. You can do more. That's functionally changing. Okay. So I could do more. I could bench press the bar, but it would require me to change my structure, which I'm not interested in doing. Okay, so major organs of the body. So this is basically welcome to your body. Let's go. Okay. So basically you have your basic organ systems, right? And that's kind of like what the first lab was about, right? Getting accustomed to the organ systems. By the way, the visceral organ system, things like that, we're going to unpack that system by system in 2102. That's what you get in AMP2. So this is just basically like, 4th grade level health science kind of stuff here. It's like, here's your body, here's your lungs, that sort of stuff. Basic overview, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So all these organ systems basically are built of groups of organs, right? So this is kind of like that sort of functional organization of your body. And so the group of organs will cause organ systems. And if you have multiple organ systems together, it will basically create an organism, okay, which is us, right? So we're composed of multiple organ systems, each of which is composed of separate organs. And then of course, organs are composed of cells, yes, but yes, tissues first, and then the tissues are composed of cells, right? And that's as far down as we get. Okay, let's take a look at very quickly. This is going to go blindingly fast. The first system we have, right, the integument system, that's going to be chapter 5 for us. So we're going to be taking a look at the integument system, including skin, the structure of skin, hair, and nails. Those are accessory structures of the integument system. As we start to move forward, we're going to be moving into the skeletal system, where we'll be learning a lot of bones, not just bones, but also the articulation of the bones, and also the small landmarks on the bones as well. So all the bones have little bumps and divots and holes and things like that. Those all have names. Those all exist for a reason, right? And those we will all learn what the bumps and the divots and the holes are. There's a lot of them, so just buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride. Then we actually move into a bigger system, which is the muscular system, which has a lot of muscles going on, and it's multi-layered, right? You have superficial, intermediate, and deep muscle layers. So there's muscles everywhere. Basically, this is your articulation system. Now that you've got your frame, this allows you to move your frame, right? So these are all the rubber bands that are attached to your frame so that you can actually move. Well, they similar to rubber bands. They have elasticity like rubber bands. The nervous system, the first of the integration systems. This is going to be the end of the semester. Unfortunately, it's oftentimes abbreviated because we run out of time, and because in the nervous system, it happens in every single book, and it drives me insane that they do this. Every single chapter we cover up to this point has maybe one, maybe two chapters at most per system. When they get to the nervous system, there's like 90 chapters. I'm like, what? I mean, everybody does this. McGraw-Hill does this, Pearson does this, drives me insane. It's like, how do you expect us to cover 7 chapters of nervous system at the end of the semester when we've already gone through a couple of major systems? So yeah, this is going to be highly cherry picked with a very specific focus of what do you need to have with you when you go into AMP2. Right, that's typically where the nervous system starts to shift. It becomes very utilitarian. There's a lot of cool stuff in the nervous system, but once we get to that section, that part of the semester, we focus like a laser beam on what you need to carry with you for AMP2. Okay. You start off AMP2, first of all, with another integration system, the endocrine system, which is a huge system and a lot going on there. Don't want to cover these too much, right? Because we're not going to be covering them this semester. Then we move into the cardiovascular system, which is the central system of all the systems, the system of systems, if you will. This is the grand poobah of all systems. That's not just because I have a cardiology background and that's kind of my bias. It's because it's true, right? I always tell students and chiropractors that if you don't believe that the cardiovascular system is the most important system in the body, then tell me how far you're going to get without a heartbeat. Yeah, nobody cares about your brain if you don't have a heartbeat, right? We don't define life or death by your brain. One thing defines life or death, it's your heartbeat. You've either got it or you don't. If you don't, you're dead. If you do, congratulations, right? Okay, that was me poking the bear. There's a lot of bears to poke. I just poke them all. I kind of get them all poked equally, so nobody feels left out. Lymphatic system. This is kind of like the circulatory system when it's open. So this is kind of what has like your lymph nodes and things like that. Your spleen. These are those sorts of organs, oftentimes roped into your immune system. Kind of a quasi circulatory system, immune system, support system is what it is. Then we move into respiratory system. Obviously, you got to breathe. That's always helpful. And then we move into the digestive system, which is a very, very detailed system. A lot of stuff going on in the digestive system. Another really, really good system that I enjoy going through because there's a lot going on. And we have a very strong sense of intuitive ownership of our digestive system. We spend most of our life nursing it, either in eating, dealing with our indigestion, our esophageal reflux, or on the hinder side of the digestive system, trying to figure out how come nothing's coming out or how comes too much is coming out. We spend a lot of our life thinking about this long tube. You guys are like, oh yeah, we do. And we don't want to admit it, right? Because it's just not polite. Urinary system, probably one of the next to biggest, really, really big range. And I don't mean biggest in terms of importance, biggest in terms of its touch. A few of these systems really do cross over each other. It's like a Venn diagram. They do overlap a lot. Urinary system overlaps with cardiovascular, overlaps with other types of systems as well. So this is a very important one. Of course, the reproductive system for both males and females. Most of us know where the reproductive organs are. We've largely found those for the most part. We have at least a working knowledge of how they operate and that sort of stuff. Largely, when we get into 2102, oftentimes we'll do the reproductive stuff, because there's a lot there, obviously. And the reproductive physiology is the most important, the most interesting stuff. A lot of times that will be covered in lab, and then we'll kind of focus on some of the life or death things. Because believe it or not, if your reproductive system doesn't work, you're not going to die. You may want to die, but you're not going to die. Right? So in AMP2, I focus on like, okay, where are the core systems? The ones that if you don't have these things working, you are dead. Right? And then I kind of start to fill in with, okay, what are the nice ones to have? Would it be nice to be reproductive? Yeah, that makes life better, right? But, not necessary for life. Another big theme, both in AMP1 and AMP2, is homeostasis. So homeostasis, basically, anybody know what homeostasis is? Do you cross swords with homeostasis? How many of you guys heard of that one? A couple of you guys, right? So yeah, basically what homeostasis is the idea of maintaining a sense of constant internal environment in your body. It's retaining a physiological constancy. And think about it. Most physiological metrics are like the stock market. If left to their own devices, like the stock market, it will actually fluctuate wildly. I mean, it'll be like high one moment, crash the next, high the next, crash the next. I mean, that is just too much for anybody's nerves to handle, right? And so, by the way, if you're wondering, if you're interested in the history of stock market finances, that's the way the stock market used to be. Like back before FDR, and they kind of like smoothed everything out a little bit. That's the way it used to be. That's the reason why there was like massive booms in America, economic booms, followed by catastrophic depressions. Matter of fact, a lot of people only think of the depressions as in the 30s, but in reality, some of the depressions of the 19th century were absolutely catastrophic. I mean, and that's largely because there was nothing to buffer these wild mood swings of the stock market. People were just literally at the mercy of these whimsical peaks and crashes and peaks and crashes. And the crashes crashed hard. And it took everybody down with them. Okay. So what happened during FDR, and what we now know, was actually kind of a tempering of the stock market. So now what you have, you take a look at a financial portfolio, you don't just have a bunch of wild stocks that are super, super volatile that kind of peak and crash and peak and crash. What you have is a mixture, right? The diversification of funds. Have you heard that one? Right? Diversify your holdings. What does that mean? That means basically you create a package of things that do not fluctuate as wildly as the market, so that you have a relatively stable growth. You can invest money in there and you can have a stable, predictable growth pattern, right? Now, if you want to earn a little bit more, you can toss a few more volatile stocks in there to kind of get a little bit more growth in there, or you can pull those guys out and kind of get a little bit more insulation from the wildness of the stock market, right? This is what financial advisors are doing all the time, every day, while they're watching the stock market, right? That's kind of the reason why you readjust those funds so that you can kind of maintain that constancy. But what that does to you, because none of us are financial advisors here, we don't work on the floor of the Wall Street area. We're not sitting there, bidding and selling on the floor. We want to just basically invest some money. We want it to grow, but we want to go about our lives, right? The only way you can do that is if you can create a little bit of constancy. so that you know that within a relative period of time, largely you're going to see an overall trend of growth, right, or an overall trend of decline if it's a prolonged economic contraction. Right? That is exactly how homeostasis works. Most of your physiological metabolites will fluctuate wildly if we did not have mechanisms that are designed to hold those metabolites in a relative range of constancy, so that you can have a predictable internal environment within which you can do physiological business. Does that make sense? That's what homeostasis is. Another digression, but it went somewhere. So you always have this normal range. So for instance, here's your normal range here. And of course you have these fluctuations, but it's still within this normal range. And as long as you stay within that normal range, you're good. That's basically how homeostasis works. Now, who maintains homeostasis? Somebody's got to do that, right? Well, you have a whole host of proteins and things like that that maintains that normal constancy. And that's what's called regulation. That's a lot of what we focus on in AMP2 in physiology is what are these homeostatic parameters, these metrics, and who controls them, right? When the peak starts getting too peaky, who turns it down? Somebody does. When the trough gets too troughy, who turns it back up? Somebody does, right? So somebody's got to control that and keep that in its normal range. One type of a regulatory strategy is called feedback loops. This is a regulatory mechanism. And feedback loops can come in two different flavors. They can come as either what's called a negative feedback or a positive feedback. Now, generally speaking, most feedback loops, they kind of describe what they are. So they kind of are what they are. So they will basically feed, there's some sort of a mechanism, and there's kind of like a feedback to kind of feeds back or doubles back and communicates something to sort of either positively or negatively affect this particular process, okay? Now, there's a couple of major pieces that all feedback loops have. First of all, you have to have, I want to start off with the bottom, first of all. And I don't want to do these in order, because what I want to do is I want to start off at the ground level first. And then I want to sort of add in the pieces, right? So typically speaking, what you have in a feedback loop is a regulatory scheme that allows you to solve a problem. This problem, which is your response, will solve some sort of a problem. A lot of times this can be like a chemical reaction, right? So let's say that you need more of chemical A or chemical B. And so you have a chemical reaction that will make this particular chemical. That is your solution to whatever problem there is. Matter of fact, a lot of times what I like to do is I like to talk about feedback loops in sort of a biochemical way. Okay, and I want to sort of scope out both positive and negative feedback loops, but from a biochemical perspective, because it's a little bit more kind of granular. And when you kind of get bigger, like in regulation, it kind of gets a little fuzzier, kind of like looking at a Monet, right? So it kind of makes you look like you need glasses, even though he was the one that was blind, not you. But first of all, what I want to do is I want to take a look here at the negative version. I got more space here, so I'm going to do it here. So let's say we have a negative feedback loop. And I have a molecule A that gets converted to B, that gets converted to C, that then gets converted to D. And there's enzymes that do this, little a, little b, and little c. So it's a pathway, okay? Now let's say that in this pathway, I need a lot of D. Well, if I need a lot of D for some sort of a response, then I need to figure out a way to make more D, right? So I need a way to regulate this. It's like an accelerator. I've got a way to make it. This is the mechanism, right? This is that baseline way of making it. I've got a biochemical reaction that will allow me to make D. That's the bottom level. That's the response. That's the effector piece of it, right? Now, here's the thing, though. If I'm going to make more D, then I have to have somebody who can basically turn this on, right? who can upregulate it. So there's got to be another type of a protein, or like a regulatory protein, that has the capacity to turn this on, to really upregulate this and really get this D going, right? So that is kind of like a regulator, kind of a mid-level regulator, like a light switch, for instance, where you can basically turn this reaction on or not, right? And let this reaction go. But here's the thing, though. You don't just want to turn this reaction on, do you? You want to turn this reaction on in the right circumstances. How do you know what the right circumstances are? You have to have a way of determining what your circumstances are, first of all, right? And then you have to figure out whether or not those circumstances are appropriate for what you want to do. So you have to have, number one, a way to detect your circumstances, that's perception or sensation, and you have to have a way to interpret them, right? That's integration. There's got to be a decision maker associated with this as well, right? So you need that. You need to take a look at your circumstances and take in the information first. Then there needs to be a decision maker who makes sense out of that input and is able to make some sort of a decision. From that decision, then the decision maker turns on the switch. That is that middle line, that mid-grade regulator, who will then turn the reaction on. Okay. That's basically how regulatory loops tend to work. And that's what we're talking about here with the receptor, the control center, and the effector. So the receptor is the one that is detecting the stimulus. This is basically gathering information on your environment. And it's funneling it into the control center. The control center is the decision maker. So it collects all the intelligence that it got from the receptors, sorts through all that data from the receptors, and then it has to come to some sort of a decision on some sort of an action that it needs to take. Then it will send that information out to the effector, who will then basically solve the problem, turn the reaction on in this particular case. So the effector is basically that mid-level regulator, the on-off switch guy. Okay. Now let's take a look at how this works. This is a basic, by the way, this idea is very, very, very basic to regulation. And this is actually an idea that underpins a lot of regulation and physiology in AMP2. A lot of times, I think Anthony's probably heard this one before, so here again. But a lot of times I liken it, or I kind of compare it by analogy to like a light switch. Like for instance, what you do when you go into a room. So let's imagine that what we needed to do in this room was we needed to take an exam. Okay. So we walk into the room for the first time, right? And this is what we see. What do you need to do in order to take your exam? Turn the light switch on. Okay, wait. So that's where we go. But now let's see, how did we get there, right? The first thing you notice when you walk into the room is what? It's dark. So what you did is you had receptors that brought in sensory information. You were surveying your surroundings, right? You were taking a look at your circumstances and you were bringing that information in, like the receptor, right? And then you were bringing that to your brain, right? Your brain was sorting through that information and assessing it according to what it wanted to do, which was to take the exam, yes? And then it had to make, yeah, maybe. If it was optional, then the answer is no. But anyway, right? So then your brain said, and had to make a decision, didn't it? Is this good enough? Can I do what I need to do in these conditions? The answer is either yes or no. If the answer is no, then you have to solve the problem. What was this problem to be solved? Turn on the lights, right? So that was the decision. The decision maker had to sort through all of your incoming sensation, had to make sense of it all, had to assess it against what it wants to do, and had to determine the appropriate action. The decision was made, and then the decision went out to act. But who did it act on? the effector, which is the middle manager. But the effector itself is not solving the problem. Who's solving the problem? Who's the chemical reaction in this analogy? What? So the control center would be your brain, right? That was the one, that was the decision maker, right? So who's the chemical reaction in this analogy? We do. So the chemical reaction, right, the actual mechanism that solves the problem is the light bulb itself. Because we have the technology under the appropriate stimulus to solve the problem of darkness. Just like the reaction is already wired and ready to go to solve the problem of making product D. How do we know, or how do we change its state from on to off? The effector. The effector has been told from on high to turn the mechanism on. Problem solved. So in your body, this is a theme that is all throughout. And this is how your physiology is regulated. You have sensors and receptors everywhere in your body. Your body is constantly gathering information on what's going on in you and funneling that back to your brain. Your brain is constantly making decisions about what to do relative to the information it just got. And then it sends out commands to make those changes to solve those problems. That makes sense? So you are a bunch of light switches, right? Okay, so let's look at specifics, right? So a negative feedback loop then would be one where the product actually feeds back on itself and shuts its own production down. So here's how a negative feedback loop works. When you're making product D, at some point, D will increase in concentration. When I write brackets around that, that's a notation system in chemistry that's to be read as the concentration of whatever I write inside those brackets, right? So that's the concentration of D. So in a negative feedback loop, as D begins to elevate in concentration, what happens is the quantity of D will actually come back and will repress its own production. That's a negative feedback loop. So basically what it'll do is it'll come back, and when I try to write the T, that's a repression. So it will repress it. So it'll shut down A. If you shut down A, you shut down the whole process, right? So you basically shut down D. It's kind of like a circuit breaker, if you will, right? So you get too much D and it'll actually shut its own production down because you've got enough. And that's a negative feedback loop. That's one way that you can control how much of this you have. Now, positive feedback loop, if you want to take a look at this, and I'm going to just do this real quick and then I'll stop, I promise, because I just saw the clock. This stuff gets exciting, sorry. So in a positive feedback loop, this is a situation where your D, as it increases, instead will actually come back and positively will stimulate its production. So it upregulates its own production. So what does that mean? So this is what it means. Let's go ahead and I'm just going to draw a quick graph, and I'm going to say, let's imagine that D, positive wise, right? So there's going to be a positive feedback. Let's say that D normally just increases like in a slow trickle. But something happens, and what you need is you need D levels that are up here in order to survive. But guess what? Your D is creeping along, right? By the time it gets up there, you are going to be dead. Yes? Because it's slow in coming. You need a lot of D very quickly. So what happens with positive feedback is when D reinforces its own production and upregulates its own production, it basically looks like this. So you get a lot of D in a short period of time. That gives you very quick responses. Then what you can do is you can couple that to a negative feedback loop because you have high concentrations of D that can shut down your production, and that'll bring your production back down to normal homeostatic levels. So you can use actually negative and positive feedback loops to kind of create this very quick response where you can upregulate very quickly in a short period of time so that you can generate D, save your life, and then you can use the high concentration to trigger the negative feedback loop, which will bring you back down to normal levels. That's one way to control something. That's pretty nifty. Okay, that's that. I promise I'll leave you alone. So we'll pick this up on Tuesday.